We celebrate our 30th anniversary this year. Hard to believe, but hearkening back to 1982, I remember the day when we as a staff over at First Missionary Church sat around and considered what would it be like to plant a church. There wasn't much church planting going on in those days. We really did not know what we were doing. But the idea seemed to resonate with us, and so a city map was put on the wall and we just looked at it. Where would be a good place to plant a church? And we thought, perhaps it's going to grow south. And so after giving this some prayer and thought, 50 of us decided that we would launch out. Began in the Southeast YMCA. And God began to grow us numerically, and ultimately, we bought this land right here on Tillman Road, surrounded by cornfields. Early on, even with our growing numbers, we were very much homogeneous. That is to say, we were all the same. South Fort Wayne was pretty much solidly middle-class white individuals. And with the death of the industry on the east side of town, the dominoes began to fall. As the industry left, the tax base became compromised, the schools began to struggle, the mall ultimately died, and before we knew it, the city was changing. Little by little, the inner city, if you will, began to move our way. But by and large, we stayed about the same. We were still, by now, a very large church, very stable white church here in South Fort Wayne. But in parallel with all of this, God began to do a work in me about what the church really was supposed to look like. I'll never forget during my summer study break at a cabin way up in Ontario, reading the book of Nehemiah. And as I began to read the book of Nehemiah, I saw this amazing man moved because the city that he loved was in ruins. And all the while, South Fort Wayne began to get a reputation as a dangerous place to be, a changing place, a place that you hope to move out of. But as I began to see Nehemiah weeping over his city, before I knew it, I found myself weeping over mine. I'd always lived in South Fort Wayne, grew up here, was raised here. And when I recognized that I loved this place, I realized that like Nehemiah, I had to come to grips. Would I ignore it? Would I move away from it? Or would I embrace it? And that summer was catalytic for me. Returned and shared over the next months with leadership here that I sensed God was calling us to be not only a church in this area, but of this area. Little did I know what kind of an effort it would be over the next 12 years. We recognized early on that we couldn't simply be the same as we'd always been before. If we were going to become a church of cultural and racial diversity, we'd have to see value in that. Amazingly, God showed it to me again through Scripture. I was reading through the book of Acts and I recognized that on the day of Pentecost, 120 people very much alike were all of a sudden invaded by 3,000 others. But those 3,000 were from 14 different cultures. So you had young and old, male and female, rich and poor, slave and free, black and white, ultimately Jew and Gentile later on. But it was their capacity to do life together that caused the jaded Roman world to say how they love each other. What was the message? This shouldn't be working. But I recognized the church began with intentional diversity. Then in reading Revelation 7, where it says people ultimately will be around the throne from every tribe and tongue and nation, that the church will end with diversity, I began to recognize, well, perhaps the church should always have diversity between the beginning and the end, and that's us. So we chose to make as one of our values that we would intentionally embrace cultural diversity, racial diversity. There's a difference between the two. Racial diversity would be one whereby you could say, you are welcome to come into the majority culture. You're welcome. But don't expect to change it much. Cultural diversity would say, you are welcome to embrace our community, and we expect you to change it.
When I started back in 1993, it was a white middle-class church. And over the years, as I looked at it, morph into, I think, what God wanted to be. It was, whereas I might have been seeing in black and white, it was totally different. It was socioeconomic, age, racial diversity. So it changed in a lot of different ways. It's a lot more than what I expected it to change.
The racial mix-up is totally different with all the, we're in many black families, with Hispanic, with internationals, just a huge change, and that's a big difference from when we first started off. And in a small room where everywhere you looked, we were pretty well the same. You knew how everybody else grew up, because it's pretty well like you grew up.
I moved to Fort Wayne a couple of years ago to work in this community. And so I was looking for a church to serve the people of this community. And when I moved here, I discovered quickly that the people here are intentional about serving the needs of this multicultural, multiracial community. I think that the outreach programs that they have serve the people well, and I cannot be more excited to be part of that mission.
Well, as we determined and became convicted by God's Spirit to stay in this community, even though it had been rapidly changing for the decade prior to that, the one question that comes out of that for us is, who now is our community? Who is our surrounding neighborhoods, community that we exist in? And how do we get to know them? So we just met with neighbors, and we asked, what's important to you about living here? What are the things that can be built on? What are some of the needs you see? And they responded to us. We also asked questions like, if you could say anything to the churches in this area, what would it be? And they came up with some very surprising answers. But we took this information to heart, and we started listening and learning, and taking a learning posture in your community is huge. In addition to that, we wanted to develop kind of a habit of making sure we're outside these walls and getting into our community and mixing it up with our neighbors. And that was kind of the idea of Go Day. The Go stands for the great outdoors. That is the place outside the church doors. And that's become a regular rhythm and practice around here, to go and show up and serve our neighbors and be with them in this community.
As fellowship was blessed in growing in our diversity, we aspired in children's ministry and in student life ministry to make sure that we reflected that. And so our curriculum, our volunteers, our leadership, and even our staff now reflects the diversity that we have seen in our church, and we feel more blessed for it.
I think a couple of things we did in the early days, we did several things, but two of the major ones that were intentional is we hired our first African-American staff member in Corey Laster in 2001. And then Corey worked together with several of us and put together these diversity dialogues that all the staff, all the elders, and many of our church leaders had to go through. They were mandatory. And we brought several ethnicities together in one small group of 6 people, and we just talked about our perceptions of other ethnicities. And every one of us had incredibly false stereotypes of other groups. But when you get people together and just tell your life story together, those stereotypes just melt away.
Memories of some relationships that didn't work very well, trying to form friendships, but it was just really hard to find the common ground. And I was really struck that people from the other backgrounds had to give up an awful lot to come and to help fellowship begin to change. I felt like they gave a whole lot more than we did.
It feels like every year a layer is peeled back on what it means to love each other well. I have a friend who says the expression of our love for each other is never more fully known than when we sing each other's songs. And I would just add, it's when we tell each other's stories, when we're willing to read each other's books, when we're willing to mow each other's grass and paint each other's houses. That's when love is really expressed and fully formed. So every year we just grow more and more in our understanding of what it means to love each other.
The thing that really grabbed me when I came on board here on staff at FMC was its commitment to diversity and the fact that it wanted to be intentional about it. They didn't just want to say it's something that we desire, but there is a strategy, there is a focus, a plan to make that happen and to see that happen. When it comes to diversity, a lot of people think it's a good value, but how valuable it is can be seen in the amount of intentionality put behind it.
I still don't know what I don't know. There are so many statements I make that are still so hurtful. There are so many assumptions that I have that are so false. Fortunately, I have an elder team, again, multiracial elder team and staff, who is gracious and forgiving, and we're learning. I think we're getting better at it along the way, and I think to be sure by the extraordinary growth that we have known by the minorities who are coming in here, that we're growing and learning, but by no means do we have this thing wired and are we doing everything right. But I think we're making some steps in the right direction, and hopefully by God's grace, we'll continue to do so.
I feel that it's our church, not like you said, like their church, our church, or you know, welcome to our. It's us, all of us doing life together, and that's what I feel every time I go to our church, because that's what it's all about, doing life together.